Hello, everybody. How are you? Hi, Deborah. So Troy Lance says, first one on Facebook. Oh, it's because it's my night off. That's why. Deborah says, no, me. Troy says, I need a snack. Joe's probably got his glass of wine, which you need when you talk about this stuff. Laugh out loud. Steve chuckles. L. Stephen Day, that is. And Delora says, hi all. Kate says, hi all. Glad to see you. Deborah says, hi peeps. Troy says, howdy neighbors, or as Rennie Pearl used to say, howdy. Deborah says, hashtag reject Tanden, everyone. And Troy says, remember, AFK still means away from keyboard, and BRB still means BRB. I am parent sitting, and I might have to use these two things frequently and together. Okay. Okay, Troy. Okay, I'm going to get on with it now, folks, because we've got a lot to cover. Guess what we're going to cover first? We're going to cover the most popular girl of all, namely Tanden. There's a column by Dave Dahan. Tanden on the ropes as OMB director. I'm sorry, this is by Robert Kuttner. Opposition from Joe Manchin in an evenly divided Senate could seek her nomination. On deck, Jean Sperling. There's Tanden with a self-satisfied look on her face. Senator Joe Manchin released a statement saying he can't vote to confirm Biden's nominee for OMB director, Tanden, because of her personally insulting tweets directed at key Republicans while she was serving as the head of the Center for American Progress. Manchin said it's going to make it hard for her to work with Republicans, and he's not wrong. But why does she have to work for? But why does she have to work with Republicans anyway? I don't understand that. They're certainly not going to vote with the Democrats on anything important. So why does she have to work with them? It's much more important that she's able to work with the progressive Democrats that she's insulted for many years and trolled for many years running now. Much more important. He wants to block her because it's going to be hard for her to work with Republicans. She's not going to work with Republicans. He says, I believe her overtly partisan statement, as Joe Manchin says this, will have a toxic and detrimental impact on the important working relationship between members of Congress and the next director of OMB. He seems to have pretty well decided he's going to vote against her. But Jen Psaki says Biden's sticking with Tanden. She says, Neera Tanden is an accomplished policy expert, what a joke, who would be an excellent budget director, and we look forward to the committee votes next week and to continuing to work toward a confirmation through engagement with both parties. Anyway, the word from Kuttner is that Manchin's opposition could well sink Tanden. He says, normally you might expect Biden to enlist a Republican or two to offset the negative vote of Joe Manchin. But the Manchin is the last senator Biden wants to cross because the $1.9 trillion relief package is hanging in the balance. And of course, Susan Collins has already said that she's not going to vote for her. She doesn't like her for the same reasons as Manchin. And Mitt Romney said that he's not going to vote for her for the same reason as Manchin's. So Kuttner asks, if not Tanden, then who? He says, my sources say Gene Sperling, one of the more progressive veterans of the Clinton-Obama era. He's already served as head of the National Economic Council. So in a way, taking over OMB would be a demotion for him. But still, he's probably going to serve. Sperling was the author of several of the more imaginative policy proposals written for the Biden campaign. I didn't know there were any that were imaginative. When the game of musical chairs ended, he was one of the few senior campaign aides who did not land a top job, but was advised to keep his powder dry just in case. He's become more of a progressive since leaving office, says Kuttner. His 2020 book, Economic Dignity, helps offset some youthful indiscretions of the Clinton years, such as his work on the 1997 Balanced Budget Act. And most progressives would applaud, but he is just orthodox enough to win easy confirmation. He drowned out a progressive senior economic team. That is good news, isn't it? Dean Baker, the founding director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, who certainly is progressive after a fashion, told Kuttner, quote, Gene's views have genuinely evolved from when he was in the Clinton administration. While I would not have wanted the Gene Sperling of 25 years ago to hold the top spot in the Biden administration, I think the Gene Sperling of today would be an outstanding pick as head of OMB. So Kuttner is pretty trustworthy. He's been a progressive for years and years and years and years. He's never signed on to MMT, so he's an old-style, old-fashioned progressive. But still, if he trusts Sperling, then maybe Sperling will be okay, especially because we're not going to get Stephanie Kelton. That's for sure. And we're not going to get Warren Mosler or Pavlina Chernyeva. So, and we wouldn't get Dean Baker either. So Gene Sperling comes off as pretty good. In this case, should Tanden go down, Biden's second choice would be a lot better than his first one. Good news, if it sticks, there are a number of other candidates who are popping up. And you can't trust Biden to pick the good candidate. Here's a piece by Greg Palast. He's a real good one, with real good information. And Greg says, Texas gets laid. How the Bush family turned off the lights. Turned off the lights. Maybe because Texas gave us that wet-lipped huckster, Ted Cruz, you think the state deserves to freeze in the dark. I get that, but it's not their fault, at least not the victims burning family heirlooms to stave off frostbite. What happened was entirely predictable. Power distribution expert attorney um, 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 Beth Emery. By the way, I know Beth Emery. I didn't realize when I read this before, but her husband, okay, is Lee Emery, who at one time was a partner with me in an ill-fated venture. By the way, they spelled her name wrong. It's Emery. She is a power distribution expert attorney. She is. And anyway, she said of the blackouts, what happened was entirely predictable. She told me this 20 years ago after the first blackouts in Texas and California, following the cruel experiment called deregulation of the power industry. Until 1992, I should say of Beth Emery, she is not in any sense a flaming liberal. So she did not come to this opinion, okay, or this position because she has a liberal bias. She is someone who was just concerned about Texas losing power. Until 1992, the U.S. had just about the lowest electricity prices in the world and the most reliable system. For a century, power companies had been limited by law to recovering their provable costs plus a, quote, reasonable, unquote, i.e. small profit. But in 1992, George H.W. Bush, in the last gasps of his failed presidency, began to deregulate the industry. Quote, deregulate, unquote, is a misnomer. Quote, decriminalize, unquote, describes it best. With the free market supposedly setting the price of power, Texas-based Enron, that's why he said Texas got laid, because if you recall, the head of Enron was Ken Lay, gentleman with the name of Kenneth Lay. So that's where that pun came in. Texas-based Enron was free to use such techniques as, quote, ricochet, unquote, quote, get shorty, unquote, and quote, Death Star, unquote, to blow prices through the roof when weather shut down power plants. And Greg Pallas says, this week was not the first game of Texas gouge 'em. Enron was not the only Lone Star Power pirate. Houston Power and Light was ramping, quote unquote, plants up and down at odd hours, which whistleblowers said was deliberate. Bush's son, quote, shrub, unquote. I haven't heard that in a long time, except when Bonnie says it. She loves to say it. Texas Governor George W. Bush signed a law in 1999 forcing the state's hapless customers to accept any price the quote, free, unquote, market dictated. Enron CEO Ken Lay showed his appreciation by becoming Baby Bush's #1 donor for W's presidential ambitions. This week, wholesale electric prices in Texas, normally $50 per megawatt hour, busted over $9,000 per megawatt hour. Again, it happens with every cold snap and heat wave. One shop owner, Akila Scott Amos, showed the Daily Piece her electric bills, which blew up from $34 per month to $450 for a single day. Update, Akila just reached out to us via Twitter, told us the balance she owes has now risen to a staggering $11,048.75 due to surge pricing. So, cutting the power lines to Texas, that's why this happens, cutting the power lines. By the way, Last year, she paid $33.93 for the entire month of February. So this year, she's paying $11,400. Yep, you got it. It's a crime. It should never be allowed to happen. Every state in America interconnects their power lines to provide backup in case of emergencies, except Texas. To prevent federal regulation, Texas deliberately has refused to connect its lines to other states. The federal government, which has restored a modicum of protection, can only police utilities connected to the national grid. So Texas literally cut itself off from the rest of the USA's electric system. Texas Governor Greg Abbott blames windmills for this week's deadly disaster. Some wind farms froze. But California is sitting on massive excess power capacity. With 80,000 megawatts of capacity, the Golden State often gives away power free to other states. This week, the sun is shining here in LA, and our solar, wind, and hydro generators could easily unthaw Texas if the Lone Star State hadn't been laid by the bushes. Of course, the rulers of Texas, the beneficiaries of freezer burn pricing, know this. This week, former Texas Governor Rick Perry, Trump's first energy secretary, said, quote, Texans would be without electricity for longer than 3 days to keep the federal government out of their business, unquote. Well, maybe Rick Perry would, because he probably has a generator for his place. Well, Rick and Ted can tan in Cancun, while oxygen machines in Laredo shut down. Okay, the solution, democracy. I didn't need a crystal ball in 1998 when I predicted California, Texas, Oregon, and Rio de Janeiro would go dark and cold if they deregulated their power markets. In a series of lectures at Cambridge University and London School of Economics and the University of Sao Paulo, yes, I had a life before journalism. I said, in academic terms, the screamingly obvious, there is no such thing as a, quote, free, unquote, market in electricity. No, electricity isn't a bagel. You can't skip it in the morning when the price goes berserk, nor shop at another electricity store. The alternative to blackouts and price gouging is democracy. And regulation is merely the enforcement of public policy voted rules to protect the public from economic overlords. The alternative to free market mania was first applied by the man who electrified America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Listen to FDR. To the people of the country, I have but one answer on this subject. Judge me by the enemies I have made. Judge me by the selfish purposes of these utility leaders who have talked of radicalism while they were selling watered stock to the people and using our schools to deceive the coming generation. My friends, my policy is as radical as the Constitution of the United States. I promise you this. Never shall the federal government part with its sovereignty or with its control of its power resources while I'm president of the United States. Boy, would I love to hear a statement like that from Joseph R. Biden, Mr. Robinette. To make his point, the Roosevelt Justice Department arrested the nation's top utility executive and busted up his holding companies. Democratizing the electric system also produced another alternative to Kenlayism, socialism. In the 1930s, much of America had no electric service. So Roosevelt launched the massive rural electric cooperatives, Tennessee Valley and Bonneville Power Administrations, and other publicly owned systems that provide cheap, reliable, nonprofit power to 1/5 of America. What fools we are not to have made that 5/5 of America. Darkness at noon in Portland. The reason Portland, Oregon went dark this week goes back to July 20th, 2005, when the governor of Oregon, Ted Bakulangoski, he of zero memory, I don't even remember anybody named Ted Kulangoski was ever the governor of Oregon, a bill that would have allowed the city's residents to take ownership of the Enron-owned power system. According to my professors, Milton Friedman and George Stiegler, the problem with the formerly regulated and publicly owned systems is that they were too reliable. Utilities who could only charge what they spent, supposedly gold plating, quote unquote, the system, i.e., invested too much into making sure it works. The privateers of Portland and of Houston can now pocket the savings from letting the systems decay, and they have. So the solution to the deadly darkness is obvious. More Roosevelt, less Bush. That was really a good one, I thought. Hope you did too. And here's another one on Tejas. It's called The Green New Deal Would Solve Texas Energy Deregulation, says Naomi Klein. And so let us retrieve that little number. And Naomi is commenting on Greg Abbott. This one is by Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez. And they point out all the suffering, in Texas. 8 million Texans remain under orders to boil water. 30,000 homes still have no power. Around 70 deaths have been linked to the winter storms, including at least 12 people who died inside their homes after losing heat. Republicans are facing increasing criticism for their handling of the crisis and their decades-long push to deregulate the state's energy system and their unfounded attacks on renewable energy and the Green New Deal. Anyway, Naomi Klein, senior correspondent at The Intercept and a professor at Rutgers University, says Republicans' reaction is, quote, because of panic, unquote, over their culpability. Quote, the Green New Deal is a plan that could solve so many of Texas's problems and the problems across the country, and Republicans have absolutely nothing to offer except for more deregulation, more privatization, more austerity. She also discusses the Biden administration's early policies on the climate crisis, the dangers of continued fossil fuel development, and her new book, How to Change Everything. And she gets a question from Amy Goodman, who starts off talking about the situation, in Texas, and plays a clip from Governor Greg Abbott, who, of course, famously by now said, this shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America. Texas is blessed with multiple sources of energy, such as natural gas and oil and nuclear, as well as solar and wind. But you saw from what Trace said, and that is our wind and our solar got shut down. They were collectively more than 10% of our power grid, and that thrust Texas into a situation where it was lacking power on a statewide basis. Meanwhile, according to Amy Goodman, Ocasio-Cortez responded to Governor Abbott's claim by writing, quote, the real deadly deal is his failed leadership, unquote. And she traveled to Texas to help the relief efforts. On Saturday, she volunteered at a food bank in Houston. And so far, she's helped raise over $5 million for Texans impacted by the storms. Talk more about the crisis in Texas. We're joined by Naomi Klein. And so she says, Naomi, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the Republican leadership of Texas blaming this catastrophe on what hasn't even happened yet, and that is the Green New Deal. So Naomi is asked why Texas Republicans fear the Green New Deal. Naomi, why? Naomi says, hi, Amy. Hi, Juan. It's good to be with you today. Yeah, it's been a symphony of voices from the Republican Party pointing the finger at something doesn't actually exist anywhere really but on paper. Certainly doesn't exist in Texas. Texas is about as far from a Green New Deal as you could possibly get, seeing as a Green New Deal is a plan to bring together the need to get off fossil fuels. I think she should have said Texas is about as far from a Green New Deal as it is from Mars. Seeing as a Green New Deal is a plan to bring together the need to get off fossil fuels in the next decade to radically decarbonize our energy system. And as we know, fossil fuels are still king in Texas. It's a plan to marry that huge infrastructure investment in the next green economy with a plan to battle poverty, to create huge numbers of good union green jobs to take care of people. It's a plan to have a universal public health care and child care and a jobs guarantee. So it's all the things that are not happening in Texas because there isn't just this extreme weather, which many scientists believe is linked to our warming planet. You know, you can't link one storm with climate change, but the patterns are very clear, and this should be a wake-up call. But Texas is also suffering a pandemic of poverty, of exclusion, of racial injustice. It certainly doesn't have a Green New Deal. And we've heard this messaging, I think, because of panic, frankly, because the Green New Deal is a plan that could solve so many of Texas's problems and the problems across the country. And Republicans have absolutely nothing to offer except for more deregulation, more privatization, more austerity. So they have been frantically seeking to deflect from the real causes of this crisis, which is an intersection of extreme weather of the kind that we are seeing more of because of climate change, intersecting with a deregulated fossil fuel energy system. That is the truly catastrophic intersection. And later on that, you have all the injustices and inequalities that mean that this doesn't impact everybody equally by any means. It's an extremely racially unjust catastrophe, as every catastrophe in the United States is. And Juan Gonzalez then comes in and says, and Naomi, could you talk a little bit about it's basically a right-wing extremism when it comes to energy policy that's been practiced in Texas, the origins of the deregulation movement that Texas pioneered, and also the other wrinkle in this. And so Naomi says, sure, and Juan says, is this notorious independent streak that Texas not only wants the United States to be energy independent, the state of Texas wants to be independent from the rest of the U.S. electoral grid so that other states couldn't come to its support in this time of crisis. And Naomi says, sure. You know, in headlines, I heard you playing a clip of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's trip to Texas, the fact that she helped raise, I believe, $5 million to this point. And you know, she's been very clear that she doesn't believe that charity is the solution to these systemic failures. And of course, she is probably the person who's most closely associated with the calls for a Green New Deal in government. But I think that what she's trying to show with this action is that government should be there to take care of people and that we should have each other's backs, particularly in a crisis. The ideology that has governed Texas now for at least 4 decades is an ideology, I think, best encapsulated by Ronald Reagan's famous phrase, quote, the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, quote again, I am from government and I'm here to help, quote, and quote again, unquote and unquote again. And you know, I think it is worth pausing over that, because that sort of glib slogan that people should be afraid of a government that's there to help when you have a catastrophe like the one that's unfolding in Texas, but more broadly the pandemic everywhere, is really quite chilling, because people need a government that is there to help. So in Texas, they just look to this extreme. So it goes back further than the 1990s, but a series of fateful decisions were made in the late 1990s when Enron, blast from the past and now defunct, but this scandal-plagued energy company hated by the late Ken Lay, led this successful push under then-Governor George W. Bush to radically deregulate Texas's electricity sector. And they won, is the bottom line. And as a result, decisions about the generation and distribution of power were stripped from regulators in Texas and handed over to private energy companies, on the basis of this logic that what's good for industry will be good for everyone else. Prices will be lower, there will be maximum competition. So you have all these private players competing with each other, and as you say, Juan, they are quote unquote independent from the rest of the grid. Now, I really, what did she say? I see some really interesting parallels with what has happened with COVID, because when you hand over essential functions of the state to private companies, whether they're healthcare companies or whether they're energy companies, what they seek to do is maximum profits. And you do that through quote unquote efficiency. Now, what does efficiency mean in practice? It means you take out all the slack in the system, because you're wringing out profits, maximum profits at every turn. So when it comes to something like healthcare or elder care, that means you don't want to have a single empty hospital bed or a single empty bed in an elder care facility, because that's an inefficiency. But then if you have a shock like a pandemic, you have no slack in the system to absorb that shock, and you have a disaster, right? What we've seen in Texas is something very similar with energy. There's no slack in the system. There's no built-in redundancies, because if you're plugged into the national grid, if you have a shock in your state or in one location, then energy from somewhere else that is not having a shock is able to come in and cover for you. In Texas, they took out all those redundancies, and so then you'll have a weather shock that puts stress on the system, knocks out capacity, and also there's a surge in demand because it's freezing and everybody wants more energy, and it just blows the system out. In the same way the pandemic blew out any capacity in the healthcare system, if that makes sense. So unsurprisingly, these private companies prioritize short-term profit over costly investments in maintaining the grid, in winterizing the grid for an extreme event. They took out all the built-in redundancies, and today Texans are at the mercy of regulation-allergic politicians who fail to require that energy companies plan for shocks like the one they're experiencing right now, and like the ones, frankly, we're going to see more and more because of our destabilized climate. Juan Gonzalez says, but Naomi, as you've often documented, every crisis brings an opportunity for other capitalists to profit. Who will benefit from this crisis? Can you talk about the shale gas company, for instance, Comstock Resources?
They accept FEMA? They accept FEMA?
I don't know. I guess they will now. So Naomi says, right, yeah, look, energy companies are. It's a windfall, as they're profoundly telling their investors. Comstock Resources is a shale gas company. On an earnings call last week, their chief financial officer said, quote, "This week is like hitting the jackpot with some of these incredible crises," unquote. Because once again, there are no protections for consumers. So all of this was sold to Texans based on this idea that it was going to lower their energy costs. But there's no protection from costs going up when you have a huge surge in demand like they're experiencing right now. So people who were fortunate enough not to lose their power, and I know you're going to be talking about this more later in the show, but people who had their power stay on are now being hit with these absolutely exorbitant electricity bills. Once again, No protections for them because it's a market free for all, which was the vision from the start. And so you have politicians like Ted Cruz now banging their hands on the table saying, this is wrong. What is it? What are these huge bills? Unquote. It's entirely legal. This is the result of the energy system that they built. Amy Goodman says. So, Naomi, you have the former Governor Rick Perry, who was also the Secretary of Energy of the United States, retweeting in an article saying, quote, if we humans want to keep surviving frigid winters, we're going to have to keep burning natural gas and lots of it for decades to come. And Naomi says, yeah. Amy Goodman says, he also went on to say, Texans would be without electricity for longer than 3 days to keep the federal government out of their business, unquote. I don't know if that's why Senator Cruz fled to Mexico to keep the federal government out of Texas. But this moment when you have this older, white, wealthy Republican of leadership of Texas, but deregulation going back to the 30s, right? I mean, for people to understand, you've got the eastern grid, the western grid in Texas. That's what you have, the electric grids in the United States. And El Paso is not a part of the Texas independent grid. And they did so much better. And right, says Naomi. Amy Goodman says, but what this means for that leadership and the young leadership that has been fighting for a Green New Deal and has been recognizing COVID as a scientific reality that Texas was disastrous in dealing with. And Naomi says, sure. I mean, there's a very strong youth-led movement in Texas that has been calling for a Green New Deal for a while. And I think they're going to be calling for that with greater confidence and greater volume and greater determination in the weeks and months to come, which is why in the New York Times piece that you mentioned, I described all this deflection as a form of panic, because we know that they know, and we know that they have no solutions for the problems they have created. All I have to offer Texans is more deregulation, more privatization, more austerity, more disaster capitalism. As usually, we're seeing waves of criminalizing people who protest against fossil fuel companies, but they don't have any solutions to real problems, which is why they're just making things up. And we're seeing that on absolutely every level. But I want to come back to what you're saying about this rift in the leadership, who really don't have to worry about their power or taking vacations in the middle of this, are clearly not worried or making these glib statements like, quote, oh yeah, we'll live without power for much longer if necessary, unquote. They're not the ones without power, right? There's so much inequality, as I said earlier. Whenever there's any kind of disaster in the United States, it follows racial fault lines and economic fault lines. I think we should think about Ted Cruz's ill-fated trip to Mexico, not as a quote-unquote, but not as a mistake, quote-unquote, as he now describes it, but in a way as a metaphor, Amy, metaphor for how these politicians actually think about the climate crisis. They don't think it's a quote hoax. They just say that publicly. They know it is real. These are people with deep ties to the oil and gas industry, and the oil and gas industry is in a lot of ways benefiting from the climate crisis because there's melting in the Arctic. It's opening up trade routes because of that. They're having to adapt all kinds of their own infrastructure to deal with the reality of climate change. They don't really genuinely believe that it isn't real. They're on the front lines of it in lots of ways. What they believe, and I think we've talked about this before on the show, is that this is somebody else's problem. They believe that their wealth, their power, and their privilege will protect them from the worst of its effects. And if we want to know what that looks like, it looks like Ted Cruz boarding a flight to Mexico in the middle of a disaster to go to the Ritz-Carlton in Cancun. So you're getting the picture, okay, of this article. Okay, it's a very good one. And the views, okay, are very good. And I urge you to read the rest of it. But I'm not going to go through the rest of it, okay? I'm just going to comment. These two articles have the situation in Texas dead to rights. They just analyze it so correctly that there's no better way to understand it. So I'll stop sharing this and go on and go further. We'll go to the vaccines now. So Biden's vaccine rollout is working, says Dave Dayen on February 22nd. He points out that as of January, 3 weeks into the rollout, only 4.3 million doses had been distributed. But in the past month, I've been far less concerned with the rollout, which has been among the best in the world. In the 49 days since January 3rd, the U.S. has delivered 58.8 million shots, with the 7-day average really moving in a straight line upward until Valentine's Day, when that average topped out at 1.7 million shots per day. Early on, about 30% of vaccines shipped had been delivered. Now the number is 84%. Only 5 countries on Earth have delivered a first dose to a higher percentage of the population than the U.S. Those are Israel, the Seychelles, the UAE, Bahrain, and the UK. And only one of them has a significant population, which is the UK, of course. Only the icy weather in much of the country stopped the momentum due to a combination of people socked in their houses and unwilling to go get the vaccine, and a delay in shipping roughly 6 million doses. Those shipments should be made up this week, and we'll get a test as to how much capacity has been built when states are more flushed with vaccine supply, since they'll have leftovers from last week and the current week's shipment. Even with a logistical hazard, the U.S. got 1.3 million shots out per day over the past week, which was about at the level of early February, and well over the original 1 million shots per day target of the Biden administration. And he says that the delays are unfortunate, and given the increasing variants could leave the country vulnerable to higher transmission and more mutations. But if it's just a 1-week blip caused by a nightmare in Texas and difficulties with shipping, and we get back on track this week, that danger could be muted. Moreover, the bumper crop of supply this week, because of the makeup shipments from last week, could be a review of the near future. Right now, the U.S. is shipping about 10 to 15 million doses per week. That should increase to 20 million per week in March, 25 million in April, and 30 million by June. If distribution ramps up similarly, you could see 4.5 million shots delivered daily by the summer. That's, incredible. In a 30-day month, that's 125 million shots or something like that, which is more than a third of the nation. The 1-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine will get a vote this Friday from the FDA's advisory committee. And although that could be a complex analysis given the variants, I'd expect approval and immediate shipping by the weekend. While the initial shipments will be small, they add to the Moderna and Pfizer rollouts, and of course, as a one-shot vaccine, each one is worth 2 of the others. There's some evidence for the idea the Pfizer vaccine generates a strong response with just 1 dose, perhaps as good as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The evidence is overwhelming that people who have contracted the virus only need 1 dose. I'd expect Pfizer to ask for changes on both, which would again stretch supply to a greater population. Pfizer is already seeking permission to store the vaccine in normal refrigerators after testing showed it can survive under those conditions for up to 2 weeks. This would allow the Pfizer vaccine to be shipped to areas without the capacity for ultra-cold storage. If you add this up, the United States is very well positioned to get the virus under control by early summer. The public even expects this now. The winter of our discontent could be made a glorious summer, but there are a couple of barriers still to cross. We're approaching our time where the binding constraint will be public willingness to take the vaccine. Without any public education campaign, a little more than half the population will take it. But that's just it. There's been no public education explaining the vaccines are safe and incredibly effective. They all stop hospitalization and they all stop death. Yes, we've heard that from John Campbell, okay, and many others, that is the news, that if people take a vaccine, they're almost certainly not going to be hospitalized, even if they get COVID, and 100% in the trials thus far, nobody died once they got a vaccine shot, and I believe it's a certain time passed. Like if they got a vaccine shot and 21 days passed, from then on, nobody died. And nobody went to the hospital either, or very few people went to the hospital either. It's incredible that the Biden administration is leaving this to a media given to hype negative stories to explain this to the public. The handful of public service announcements have rolled out, including an effective one from Boston Celtics legend Bill Russell. But private trade groups or particular executive branch agencies like the military have led the way. There's been no real broadcast message from the White House on a daily basis, hammering home that these vaccines are vital and should be taken. There's no need for a public education on the vacuum. Second barrier is getting a global rollout on par with the U.S. This is in our public health interest because more virus circulating increases the potential for more mutations, including some that cannot be defeated through vaccination. To get the world inoculated, we have to produce more vaccines, and we had to have done it months ago. The Biden administration pledged $4 million to COVAX, the global campaign to vaccinate the world, but that's not likely to go far. Yeah, Biden, why don't you just put up $100 billion for that? That will take care of it. There's a very troubling genre of article that attempts to lecture Americans on why we just can't ramp up production very much. This type of article has been written for the last 3 months in a row, which in itself proves the problem with it. Nobody doubts it takes months to retool factories, secure ingredients, and hire staff. But we're months from the point when this could have begun, and we're going to need billions more vaccines for the world. We know it doesn't take forever to build capacity. Pfizer started effectively from scratch and had factories that were ready to produce its vaccine within 6 to 8 months. The best day to replicate that process is 4 months ago, and the next best day, absent a time machine, is today. This requires funds from the industrial nations of the world to ramp up production and open source intellectual property so every country can produce vaccines. We have not come close to the limits of production, and we have not broken the patents of the vaccine makers fully during this global emergency. 500,000 Americans have died and millions more elsewhere. Each day without the maximum vaccines in circulation puts millions more at grave risk. There needs to be a lot more urgency, and Dave, of course, is quite right about that. In fact, as I'm sure some of you know already, according to the Worldometer site, we are now at 511,000. 514,996 in the United States. It keeps going up fast. because there's still a lag. In other words, we're having less new cases. That's been going on. Okay? The number of new cases has been dropping drastically over a period, okay, of time. Each day sees a drop, okay, in new cases. But today, we still saw 2,404 fatalities in the United States. And we still have 1,550 fatalities per million. There are nations in the world that are doing worse, like the UK, 1781, Belgium, 1886, Slovenia, 1824. A number of other nations, including Portugal, okay, and Italy, are worse than the United States. But we're still there at 1,550 per million. That's a lot of deaths per million. So, onward and upward. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble accessing something I scheduled, but here's the next one on vaccines. This is information about the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. Curbs transmission, an Israeli analysis suggests. Data from Israel that are awaiting, I should say. The author of this was... There's no author here. It must just be the staff of the week. Data from Israel are awaiting publications suggest the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine is not only effective at preventing symptomatic infection, but can also stop transmission of the virus in the first place. The Financial Times and Bloomberg said on Sunday. The potentially game-changing results were compiled by the health ministry in Israel, the country with the world's highest vaccination rates, in the 3 weeks leading up to February 6th. By the end of that period, more than 27% of the over 15 Israeli population had been fully vaccinated, and the preliminary real-world observation analysis found the vaccine was 89% effective at preventing infection of any kind. I find that ambiguous. It could be referring to any kind of COVID infection. It could be saying it prevents any kind of infection of whatever. I don't know which. Anyway, as is often the case with studies during the coronavirus pandemic, the findings require more scrutiny, but they're in line with those of a similar analysis conducted by the Mayo Clinic. That study looked at 31,000 people across 4 U.S. states who received at least one dose of either vaccine, determining they were around 80% effective at preventing infection 36 days after the initial vote. Oh, this was by Tim O'Donnell, by the way. CNN reports. You could read more at the Financial Times, okay, in Bloomberg, if you access this article. But that's very good news, isn't it? Very good news. Things seem to be shaping up when we get to the vaccines. So next. We have a piece from Truth App. The progressives vow to fight the Mansion and Cinema, holding up the stimulus over $15 an hour. $15 an hour minimum wage. So this one's by Sharon Zhang, Sharon Zhang, and it's February 23rd, 2021, which is today, of course. On Wednesday, the Senate, by parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough, that's tomorrow, is set to meet with Democrats and Republicans as they argue their case on whether or not to keep the $15 an hour federal minimum wage proposal in the stimulus. And McDonough's decision, which could come soon after the meeting on what's known as the Byrd Rule, will determine whether or not the minimum wage hike will live in the stimulus bill or whether it will have to be a separate bill and subject to the filibuster. That's not necessarily true. If the parliamentarian's decision is that it should be excluded, that decision is not binding on the chair of the Senate, who is Kamala Harris. She can decide to override the decision by McDonough. It's only advisory. It's not actually determinative. Now, I understand Sharon Zhang, is assuming that Biden just won't have the stomach to ask Harris to do that. But I guess that remains to be seen. But the Byrd Rule isn't the only hurdle that advocates of the $15 an hour minimum wage will have to jump if McDonough approves the provision for reconciliation. That is, progressive advocating for the wage hike will have to fight their own party, as centrist senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are resistant to the proposal. Sinema this month said to Politico the wage increase is, quote, not appropriate, unquote, to include in the stimulus bill, which is mostly because she's a big fan of the filibuster that many Democrats and progressives have been advocating to abolish. Quote, I want to restore the 60-vote threshold for all elements of the Senate's work, unquote, she said. Manchin said on Monday that if the parliamentarian rules favorably toward keeping the wage increase, he would fight to lower it to $11 an hour instead. He argues that that benchmark is more reasonable for his home state, West Virginia. However, progressives aren't willing to compromise on the wage hike. On Tuesday, Politico reported that House representatives and aides to Budget Chair Bernie Sanders say they're ready to fight a compromise that might come from the center on the minimum wage. Sanders hinted at that when he was asked about the wage hike on Monday, saying, quote, I think we're going to pass it as it is, unquote. As progressives gain more power and influence than ever in modern politics, staying steadfast on the $15 an hour minimum wage is a flex of that power. And with Joe Biden in agreement on the wage hike, though he may not be ready to fight for it, as progressives seem to be, it seems that the two centrist senators are the ones holding the stimulus package hostage with their opposition to the long-awaited hike to the minimum wage. Monday Jones of New York, and other progressives like him have raised their objections to the two centrist Democrat stance. In response to Manchin wanting to greatly lower the minimum wage hike, Jones tweeted, "This is unacceptable. The $15 an hour minimum wage is overwhelmingly popular with the American people. One person should not be allowed to hold relief hostage," unquote. And progressives have also disputed Joe Manchin's claim that the lower wage hike would be better for his state, as some pointed to an Economic Policy Institute report, which says that the minimum wage hike proposal would help lift the wages of about 225,000 workers in West Virginia and would especially benefit people of color. Others pointed out that in 2014, Manchin supported a raise of the federal minimum wage to $10.10 by 2016. In 7 years, his ambitions only grew by less than $1. Currently, the minimum wage at the federal level is $7.25. It has not been raised for nearly 12 years. This is the longest it has remained stagnant. In the meantime, the cost of living has gone up by nearly 20% across the country. Research from MIT says that a living wage in Manchin State is closer to $15 an hour than $11 an hour. $13.93 an hour is what the MIT report says someone without kids and single needs to earn just to survive in West Virginia, which also ranks 15th in terms of lowest average cost of living in the country. On average, according to the same MIT research, a living wage for a single adult in the United States was $15.41 an hour in 2020. That number goes up each year and multiplies for individuals with children. There are many progressive advocates who have been critical of the current $15 an hour proposal, saying it doesn't go far enough. The current version of the wage hike and the stimulus bill slowly hikes up the wage till it reaches $15 an hour in 2024, which some have said, like me, is too late. They also point out that if wages had kept up with the rate of productivity, it would be over $24 an hour today. Yes, indeed, it would be. So much for Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. The problem is, how are you going to make him do it? We got to make him do it. That's what this is about. So, sharing the next one. So you remember Dennis Green? They are who we thought we were, and we let them off the hook, unquote. Coach Dennis Green's immortal words are even truer of this presidency than they were of the 2006 Chicago Bears, to whom his team blew a 20-point lead despite not giving up a single offensive touchdown. That was when Dennis Green was coaching the Phoenix Cardinals, the Arizona Cardinals, I guess it is, sorry. Less than a month in, some of us already in a position to point out that the Biden administration is turning out to be exactly what we thought it would be. The question is whether the same uncritical observers who exaggerated or distorted the failings of his immediate predecessor while ignoring or explaining away those of the man under whom he served as vice president are going to let him off the hook. I'm not holding my breath. After all, if you are like me, you are probably old enough to remember a dark time when being a journalist was a very dangerous thing in America, when our hallowed, free, and independent press was under threat. The White House press secretary once asked reporters what they would be grateful for on Thanksgiving, among other horrors, which is to say, 2 months ago. Biden, we were told, was going to undo Donald Trump's assault on journalists, which is why when unhinged members of his staff threatened to, quote, destroy, unquote, them for such obvious misdeeds as reporting upon their personal lives and conflicts of interest, they're assigned to work only with reporters from other, more sympathetic publications. During last year's election, Biden announced he would begin his presidency with an executive order announcing a 100-day moratorium on deportations. He was only off by about 26,248 people, which is good for about a third of Trump's first year total. Whatever else might be said of his record on immigration, Trump deported vastly fewer people than Barack Obama, something that most journalists are inclined to explain away, except when the man himself apologizes for it. Meanwhile, apart from a wholly symbolic national masking recommendation, Biden's handling of the novel coronavirus has not in any meaningful sense deviated from the course set by his predecessor. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is certainly a departure from the preposterous rhetoric of the campaign trail about some bold new approach to a disease that has arguably been endemic for months. It is also totally surprising. What about economic issues? Sorry. So far from withdrawing from Trump's supposedly disastrous trade war, quote unquote, Biden has wisely, I think, kept tariffs in place, despite repeated promises from Democrats, including ones repeated over and over again by John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock during the runoff elections in Georgia. Biden is not committed to $2,000 individual stimulus checks, nor is he even remotely inclined to carry out the plans for cancellation of up to $50,000 in outstanding student loan debt urged on him by Elizabeth Warren and others. Yes, Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer, but they are the conservatives of the bunch. Others are urging him to cancel all student loan debt, as he has the power to do. Even his proposed child benefit package, which was supposed to be the cornerstone of his bold new progressive economic agenda, is less generous than a similar one outlined by the guy who once lost the presidential election after dismissing half the American people as worthless scroungers. None of this should be remotely surprising. Biden's election was a triumph of the center-right consensus that captured all our institutions, political, social, economic, and cultural, long ago. That consensus is about as likely to be subject to the kind of scrutiny that revealed the caging of children to an astonished American public long after it had become a normal practice during the Obama administration. The most remarkable thing is not the fact that Biden is governing in exactly the manner he was expected to, but the unanimous support his candidacy received from would-be progressives in 2020. This is the guy whose campaign effectively ended Me Too, first by dismissing what had once been widespread concern in mainstream liberal circles about his bizarre, handsy behavior, and then by suspending what had previously been the acknowledged norms surrounding an opponent of racial busing and the kind of septuagenarian white man who cannot help but observe while watching television that, quote, every second or third ad out of 5 or 6 should turn out to be biracial couples, unquote. He is who we thought he was. Who did we think he was? We thought he was sort of half a segregationist as well as a neoliberal, thoroughly in the pockets of the corporate elite in this country. And off the evidence of all that he has done in his administration so far, it appears we did know who he was. So one more before we go to your comments and questions. And this is Dave Dayen's column for today. He points out the American Rescue Plan gets surprisingly little pushback. And he says, yesterday the House Budget Committee advanced the American Rescue Plan. Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion effort to end the coronavirus pandemic and revive the economy. We have a bill, and it should pass the House this week. To clarify, that's a bill that came out of the Budget Committee in the House. It probably will have to be touched up a bit by which committee is it? Gets it now? I forget. It's one final committee. But it seems to be a minor change. And it should pass the House this week, provided nearly every Democrat votes for it. Speaker Pelosi only has 5 votes to spare, and there's little expectation that any Republicans will take the leap and vote for the bill. Section 2101, raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025, is in the House bill. The fate in the Senate is up in the air. There are 2 issues. First, the parliamentarian has to rule on whether the minimum wage increase is eligible to be included in the reconciliation bill under the Byrd rule, whereby all elements must have a direct budget impact. CBO scored the bill as costing $54 billion over 10 years, but just that score isn't enough because reconciliation is a dumb system, and let's just eliminate the filibuster already so we don't need reconciliation, says Dave. That ruling could take place as soon as Wednesday. Senate Budget Committee Chair Bernard Sanders expressed confidence that the measure will be ruled in order. There's also the matter of at least 2 Senate Democrats not supporting the wage increase for different reasons. Joe Manchin, of course, who wants to reduce the wage hike to $11 an hour. He said he would offer that as an amendment. There's some support for a lower wage if that placates Manchin and gets something passed. And the Democrats have also talked about adding small business tax relief to alleviate concerns that they won't be able to afford the higher wages, which is odd because all their competitors have to deal with it too, and it's likely to be passed on to consumers. But Senator Kyrsten Sinema appears to be opposed to the very notion of including the wage increase in the relief package, regardless of the dollar amount. Seems like this fight is just being delayed until the parliamentarian makes a decision. That decision can always be overruled, so it's not really a barrier. But Manchin has said he would never overrule a parliamentarian. Of course, it's not up to him. And Democrats would rather deal with the issue once they know the procedural terrain. What's interesting is that the minimum wage issue is not just the most contentious, but practically the only contentious element of a huge bill that needs practically every Democrat in Congress in order to pass. There are certainly other things that might flare up. The House Ways and Means Committee pared back the unemployment extension by 1 month. It now expires in August instead of September to, quote, pay for, unquote, a fix to millions of multi-employer pensions. Instead of building in a cushion to get the $1.9 trillion figure for things like this, Democrats put that number in their reconciliation instructions and now have this cap to deal with. So once CBO scores the whole bill, there may need to be changes and even tax increases or closed loopholes in the bill. There are other measures that belong, like waiving taxes on expanded unemployment benefits to prevent surprise tax bills, or relief for the $1.6 million student loan borrowers who are ineligible for the current payment pause. One thing unlikely to change at this point is the $1,400 checks. By yesterday, Janet Yellen correctly made the point that, quote, there are pockets of pain that go beyond what can be reached in highly targeted ways, unquote, shutting down the effort to limit the checks beyond what's been done in previous bills. Claudia Sahm has a more technical case against deeper targeting, but that argument has been muted for now. And so has almost everything else. Republicans have not found an angle to derail this very popular bill. The best they can do is say, quote, of course giving money to people is popular, unquote. Well, yes, especially during what has become an enduring economic crisis for too many people in America. The best argument that you can make is that Democrats should have moved on this sooner, but people will remember the relief they got, not the timing of the calendar. That's true to a certain degree, but I'll bet the people who missed their rent payments on February 1st, because Democrats didn't move on that bill faster, will remember if they get this payment on April 15th or March the 16th, they will remember they didn't have it on February 1st. And that was because the Democrats did not move fast enough. They will especially remember it if they've been evicted because it wasn't there. Save for a couple of pieces, Joe Biden looks like he's going to get the bill that he wanted, and we'll see how it works. There's certainly tension between Biden and the party's left flank, and there always will be, because that's the left flank's role, to push Democratic leaders to do better. But we should pause to marvel at the quiet audacity of the relief package, the size and scope of which represents a real departure from the free market dominance of the past. Okay, and the debate over whether this is all too much and will lead to crushing inflation depends on whether you think the economy is already poised for success, or whether you think widespread public need in the country still requires a rescue. Fortunately, our age of expansive inequality allows everyone to pick and choose their focus, yet everyone's getting packages delivered and the rich are buying houses, so you can stress a blue-collar revolution in construction and warehousing. Yes, spending statistics put the economy on track for a boom, with growth unlike we've seen since the Morning in America days of the mid-'80s. Of course, that's only true because of building in the fiscal boost from the recovery plan. Yes, you could even talk about demand outstripping factory production, creating shortages that could lead to scarcity and inflation. But there's another story where lower skilled jobs requiring less education are imperiled. Restaurant, retail, and hospitality jobs are going to be particularly hard hit. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections, the travel industry is going to be sour for a long time. These happen to be large sectors of the economy concentrated in the low-wage sector, and this puts them even further behind for retirement, a particular problem with lower net worth Black Americans. In other words, it's a big country, and both things can be true. We can have robust growth that leaves millions behind in a painful transition, but that's accelerated by the pandemic. We haven't figured out how to deal with that, but more fiscal spending is a good bridge. So says Dave Dayen, and so says I. And now let me turn to your comments. A lot of chatting in here. Here we go. So Laura says, hi all. Kay says, share. And Troy says, hashtag reject Tanden. Deborah Wilson says, what did she do in the Clinton White House? She raised money for Hillary Clinton. She worked on the donors. She was basically Hillary Clinton's personal, uh, her personal go-to girl, her gal Friday. That's what she did in the Clinton White House. Kay says she won't work with either ones. And Deborah says she's nanny nut job. Deborah says Jen, that is. Even with the coveted Coke endorsement, she's also supported by Bush, OMB Director Mitch Daniels, and former GC of Coke Industries, and Senator Flake. Steve Gonzo said even with the coveted Coke endorsement, she's also supported by Bush, OMB Director Mitch Daniels, former GC of Coke Industries, and Senator Flake. And Kay says many people are trying to draft Beto to run for governor. Evelina says, hope he runs. Kay says, yes, me too, Evelina. They got better people than Beto to run. But Beto has at least been doing something for Texas lately, hasn't he? Evelina says these people have a new Facebook page too. Evelina says, oh yeah, which one? Kay says, let me look and get back to you. Troy says there's no such thing as a free market in electricity. Electricity isn't a bagel. You can't skip it in the morning when the price goes berserk, nor shop at another electricity store.
Joey?
Yeah. So, and Kay says, Beto O'Rourke spelling for governor. Check it out. I joined it. Evelyn says, thank you. I will. Troy says, I'm a fan of Beto O'Rourke. Spell check, please. But he's got to be better than what, I'm not a fan of Beto, but he's got to be better than what they have right now. Texas is very Republican, though slowly changing. Evelina says, anyone who says less Bush is all right by me. Kay says she was on the Majority Report too. And Deborah says a hot tip, Fault Lines on YouTube, 7 a.m. Eastern is mind-blowing. And they have Steve Grunbaum of MMT fame on regularly, which is how I got turned on to them. They have distinguished guests on to speak on subjects of the day, here, okay, and everywhere. And Jamarl Thomas is one of the hosts on there. I think he's now the primary host, and he is one of my favorite people too. Troy says Fault Lines is also on terrestrial radio, actual radio stations, but only in D.C. and Kansas City, as far as I know. Yes, because Fault Lines is on the Sputnik network. Deborah says in the Sputnik channel and Jamarl Thomas's YouTube. Kay says we really do need to have more progressive shows on radio. Ricky Rand says hi, Dolores. And Troy says, Deborah Wilson, I've been following Jamarl Thomas for at least 3 years or more, long before he had the Sputnik gig. Yep, me too. Kay says, don't know if you're east or west or between, but I assure you it's worth your time to tune in. They start each hour, 3 total, with world headlines and discuss them. Troy says you can also get them by RSS podcast. Kay says, I want the J&J one-shot vaccine. Kay says, I subscribe to them on YouTube and we'll check them out. Troy says, Native American reservations have been hit very hard by COVID-19. Yes, I know. Cases, yes, it's so sad what has been done to those poor people. Evelyn says, I'm not so sure they should be stretching the doses, only giving people 70% by immunization, which is what one dose accomplishes. Actually, the J&J is supposed to be better than that. I believe it's supposed to have an efficacy, okay, of 85%, and also it's supposed to completely shut down the possibility of hospitalization, okay, and especially death from COVID. So it seems to me that stretching doses in that way is a good way to give everybody protection that protects against the worst. Then there's time to go back and give everybody booster shots. Evelina says, not sure about that. Kay says, well, the J&J one has few side effects and keeps people from getting sick enough for hospitals or dying. Evelina says, I'd want a loved one to get the full 95%. Yes, but from a public health point of view, the question is whether you give fewer people the full 95% or more people the very substantial protection which is offered by the 85%. The reason why I emphasize that is because contemporary flu vaccines that we all take are only efficacious to the extent of 70%, but they're enough to make the flu, to neutralize the flu as a threat every year. Because, of course, there are fewer and fewer cases, and the viruses die out. So even with 70% effectiveness, it would be good. Johnson & Johnson at 85%. That's really terrific, especially for a single dose. Kay says, we help pay for their public health service. If we had one, we'd be way better too. Single payer now. Evelina says, don't even get me started with Israel, laugh out loud. Yeah, don't get me started either. Kay says, I know, Evelina, upon me too, laugh out loud. And Troy says, as a former Arizonan, I can't stand cinema. Yeah, cinema is so selfish, seems to me. She's really selfish. I'm going to sort of center myself a little in the screen, a little more. That's a little better. And Troy says, I wish I could say that Bernie Sanders represented me locally, but I'd have to move to Vermont for that to be true. You would, and it's much colder in Vermont. Okay, I think you're living where? In Texas now, Troy? Kay says, Troy, I lived there a while too and hated it. Why did you hate it? Oh, Arizona. You live in Arizona. Arizona needs a raise. Expensive to live there. Troy says, oh, you're there now, Troy. Oh, cool. I actually love the mountains in the summer and the desert in the winter in Arizona, and the Mexicans and Native American cultures there. But yeah, some of the Republicans there really got on my nerves. It didn't used to be that way. Way different back in the 1970s and even into the early 80s. Much different state now, it's sad. If I go back west again, I'll probably go to Nevada or maybe Oregon. Case is way overpopulated now and too expensive to live there. Kay says, Oregon would be nice. Got the fires now, Kay. Troy says, yeah, Arizona's more than tripled in population since I first lived there. Tucson at first, later up in Bullhead City, and then Phoenix area. Evelina says, Facebook is not letting me like all of a sudden. Oh, God, Facebook's awful. Steve says, I loves Arizona, had GFs in Tucson and Phoenix, I guess that's girlfriends. And D, round trip flights, $49.99. That was nice. Kay says, Phoenix area sucked bad air quality alerts almost every day when I lived there. Kay says, my roommate there was a huge bitch, and that didn't help either. Deborah says, we did know who he was, Trump light. Evelina says, nope, that doesn't help. But no matter where you are. Steve says, I managed apartments and shuttled cars between Tucson and Phoenix. Moved to Tucson, worked for Chateau Hotel Apartments. I was on a roll out west. Kay says, but lucky you, I hear Tucson is nice, but never went there. Deborah Wilson, but Joe is Obama on foreign policy and trade and social spending. Well done, Biden voters. Yeah, I'm afraid he is. I'm afraid he's going to push the TPP. And I'm dead set against the TPP. I think it's giving away U.S. sovereignty. I wrote a book about that called Declarations of Dependence on my website, about the fight against the TPP in 2015. Troy Fallon Lance says, Steve Gonzo, your last name wouldn't be Gonzagowski, would it? Had a school friend named Steve Gonzagowski, spell check. Steve Gonzo says, nope, sounds made up. That's funny. But Evelina says, Biden got voters through default. Once Bernie was out, it became a dilemma for a lot of people. It did. That's exactly what happened. Evelina says, at first I thought it was short for Gonzalez. Kay says, still hoping to save. Sorry. And Evelina says, Freudian slip, been having a lot of those lately. Kay says, don't like Clinton or Neera. Evelina said, Dr. Joe is that awful woman, Biden Newland, Biden's advisor. Yes, she is. I think he's been trying to get her confirmed, but I don't know if he's gotten her confirmed. She has a lot of enemies among the progressives, including me. Badia Swift says, on break before will definitely run if you give him stuff to stand on, like tables, podiums, and Texas snowmen. Steve Gonzo says, my mom get hashtag 2 mañana, the second shot. And Dia says, I saw that Bernie is voting against Biden's agriculture department pick, along with the Republicans, laugh out loud. Yeah, Biden's agricultural department pick is terrible. He's terrible. And he's also going to help with the TPP negotiations. He's got to be stopped. He's terrible. He's got to be made to resign. Lee Camp comedian at Krish Mohan, has just had a YouTube video deleted for asking if the U.S. is a true democracy, which of course is a completely just and important question on so many levels. We can't ask these questions anymore. We can never grow. I don't understand that, because I have flatly stated that we are not a democracy on some of my programs and argued that case and read out articles that make that case as well. Troy says Gonzagowski is actually a real name of Polish origin. I'm sure the spelling has been Americanized. Evelina says Steve Gonzo hugs for mom. Troy says I live near Kansas City. Joe Firestone, but I used to live in Arizona. I see, Troy. If you live near Kansas City, you must be not too far away from UMKC. Steve Gonzo says, I think I got married in Arizona. And Troy says, he gives the link to my books page. It's Joe's books. Yeah. I think I may have written more books than any of the MMTers, any of the other MMTers, I should say, with the exception of Randy Ray and Bill Mitchell. They probably have more books than I. Kay says, he is terrible. I'm a master gardener. Troy says, he gives the link to my new economic perspectives page. Yes, I haven't been there for a few years. The reason why I haven't been there for a few years, it was my choice, basically. Okay, I love Bill Black. I love his writing, his positions. Okay, I frequently watch his stuff when he makes a personal appearance because I really, really like the guy. But when Stephanie Kelton left and Bill took over as the editor in the UMKC blog, he would sometimes let blogs sit there for days before he okayed them for publication. And a lot of my blogs were about current things. So in 2 or 3 days, they got old. Okay, so I got annoyed with this, and I set up the Joseph M. Firestone site, and I just began to blog over there. I mean, I don't get anywhere near the audience, but at least my blogs don't get old. Now, I haven't posted blogs there since I believe the most recent one was probably in 2018 or 2019 because I got involved in live streaming. And the live streaming right now is taking all my time. So that's the story, okay, the blogging. But I did blog over there from 2012 until about 2016. So for 4 years. And I have lots and lots of blog posts there. And I believe they're very good if you care to take a look. And of course, that is the MMT site. So most of the blog posts I did were on MMT. Dia said, I really hope that money AOC raised for the Texas heartbeat people doesn't end up in the neoliberal pockets via paying their price gouging electric bill. I think it's mostly going for food and for housing. Dia says, if Beto has something to stand on, typo earlier, I caught that. Steve says, well, at least I got a chuckle from Bonnie. He says, I did get married in Arizona. Troy says, okay, well, I like to go back in time and look up all the stuff that I missed from time to time. Kay says, thank you all for another great discussion. I live for these and love you all. And we love you too, Kay. I'll be back tomorrow night with another one of these. Don't you worry. I'll be back also on Thursday. And I'll try to get back to the short takes. I've just been too busy. Like, I had an unexpected engagement last week. I'm sorry, on Sunday night. Okay, it developed actually rather fast. I was invited to do a lecture to a class over in India on knowledge management, which is one of my specializations. If you look up the books, you'll see I have a number of books, okay, in the knowledge management area. So I was invited by a philosophy of knowledge management, by a professor in a global business school over there to do a presentation on the philosophy of knowledge management, which is an area that I am very strong in. So I did that for close to 2 hours on Sunday night. And then also I had a friend of mine get in touch on Sunday, a very good friend and former co-author, okay, of mine. And he needed some help with some measurement problems. So I've been trying to do that for him. Ricky Rand said, India, that's cool. Yeah, it was cool and very unexpected. Deborah says, thank you, Joe Firestone. Well, thank you for coming, Deborah. Thank you all for staying. And I guess I'm going to say good night now. And I'll see you tomorrow. Sleep tight, everybody.